War was declared in 1939. I remember well the Sunday morning the Prime Minister made the announcement. We are now at war with Germany. Within about half an hour, the Bathgate area heard a sound. In fact, they heard two sounds that they'd never heard before. The first sound was the sound of the air raid warning. A weird wailing sound to tell people, to warn people that enemy aircraft were approaching. In fact, 3 aircraft had come up the Firth of Forth and were trying to bomb the Forth Bridge. The second sound was that of anti-aircraft gunfire. I didn't know it at the time, but I was going to be very, very familiar with these sounds. Well, within a few weeks, young men started to be called up, conscripted actually is the word, conscripted for the Army, for the Navy, for the Air Force, and off they went. Early 1940, I was conscripted and sent to the Royal Regiment of Artillery at Carlisle to do my training. There I was trained to be an anti-aircraft gunner, an AK gunner as we call them, AK being the phonetic sound for A, AA, or AK gunner. Well, in fact, I was on the instruments which controlled the guns. We had a height and rangefinder, a thing like a big telescope on its side, and by turning handles, etc., you could determine the height of an airplane. The other instrument, main instrument, was the predictor. This directed the guns so that when the gun fired and the shell travelled from the nozzle of the gun to a point in the sky, the aeroplane had travelled from its position to this point where the shell exploded, in theory, so that each time the gun fired, in theory, it shot down an enemy aircraft. Unfortunately, the predictor was not just quite so accurate as all that. Although, as it was proved later, it was fairly accurate. When I finished my training, that was 1 month doing square bashing, that is marching and rifle drill, because a soldier has got to march and he's got to be able to use a rifle. And then the next 2 months, we were taught how to use our instruments and guns. And as I say, at the end of the 3-month period, I was then considered to be a fully trained soldier and ready to be sent to a unit. We left Carlisle and went to Woolwich, near London, to await our draft. Draft means you're posting to a unit. Within a couple of days there, we were kitted out with KD, khaki drill. That is a light-coloured shirt, shorts, socks, topi. Though nobody told us, we knew by the clothing that we had been issued with that we were going to the Middle East or someplace where it was fairly warm. Within another 2 days, I received my posting, my draft, and with 36 others, 37 of us in all, and 4 3.7 mobile anti-aircraft guns, we went to Liverpool, where we joined not a troop ship, that's the ship normally used to convey troops, but a battleship, the Valiant. We left Liverpool and we joined up with other ships, all naval vessels of course, cruisers, another battleship, an aircraft carrier. In fact, it was HMS, it was the aircraft carrier Illustrious on its first commission and commanded by Lord Mountbatten. You know Lord Mountbatten, who was blown up and killed by the Irish terrorists last year. He was its commander, and the aircraft carrier Illustrious was on its very, very first commission. We joined a convoy, a naval convoy, with the battleships and the aircraft carrier in the centre, and ringed by destroyers. Now these destroyers, their job is to search for submarines and sink them if possible, so that they're up, down, they're like a dog. You've seen a dog with a flock of sheep. It's round one side, it's round the other side, it's at the front, it's at the back, it's everywhere at the one time. This is how the destroyers are in a big convoy. Now, when we left Liverpool, we sailed due west, more than halfway out to America. This was to avoid the submarines, or U-boats as they were called, which were lurking round the coast of Britain, waiting to prey on any lone ship that came along. Well, we went round in a big sweep, in a big semicircle, and eventually round to Gibraltar. Gibraltar, of course, is the keyway, or the gateway, to the Mediterranean. Now, we didn't know it at the time, but we found out later. We sailed into the Mediterranean. Now, this convoy, or a similar convoy, had about 4 times before done the same. Came to Gibraltar and sailed into the Mediterranean, which incidentally was held by the Germans and Italians. And no convoy had ever gone through the Mediterranean since the outbreak of war. On each occasion, when the convoy was spotted by enemy aircraft, because there were always aeroplanes flying around just to see that no boats were coming into the Mediterranean, whenever they were spotted, they turned and sailed back the way they had come. Well, first afternoon we were in the Mediterranean. Along came a German aircraft, spotted us, saw us, so we turned and sailed back the way we'd come. But when night had fallen, when darkness had fallen, we turned again and sailed into the Mediterranean. Now, the captain of the Valiant was a very, very understanding gentleman. He had with him 37 young soldiers, of whom I was one, who didn't know the first thing about a boat, or the Navy tactics. So he explained to us, this is how we found out what they had done before. He explained about having turned whenever they were spotted. But this time we were not going to turn. We were going to sail through the Mediterranean, and nothing was going to stop us. Now, the most dangerous bit was coming fairly near Sicily, where we had to go through what they term the Straits of Pantelleria. Now, he explained to us, we had a channel about 1 mile wide. Now, that's not very wide when you consider the size of our convoy. We had a channel 1 mile wide. On one side of us, we had a minefield. You know what mines are? These big round things with horns sticking out that float about the ocean. And if a boat just touches the horn of one of these, it blows up. Well, we had a minefield on one side and shore batteries, that's guns, on the other side, with one single solitary passageway 1 mile wide for us to go through. Now, the captain explained this to us, and he said, we will pass through the straits at the darkest possible time and with all possible speed. If nothing happens, we will carry on. But if one shot is fired at us, even one shot from a rifle, we will stop and blow Pantelleria out of the water. By Jove, I was praying that no shots would be fired. And I think an awful lot more were praying, because as we approached the straits, nobody spoke in a voice louder than a whisper. Are we near it yet? However, nothing happened, and we sailed through. Next morning, when dawn broke, we were clear of Pantelleria and within sight of Malta. You know Malta, that little island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Again, the captain spoke to us, and he said, well, we will call into Malta and let these young soldiers off. If we can get in, anyhow. If we can't, well, we'll drop them off somewhere. So at that point, I had no idea where we would eventually be dropped off. Now, I remember, well, I'd never been on a boat before. I'd never been out of Britain before, for that matter of it. I remember standing on the deck, leaning on the rail, looking at Malta in the sunshine, and wondering, is this where we're going to be? What sort of place is it? What lies ahead of us? And all these thoughts were running through my mind, and I was quite oblivious to anything at all that was going on round about me. I was completely in a world of my own. But I was soon brought back to reality by a sound that I'd never heard before, and it absolutely struck terror into me. The sound of falling bombs, and the crunch as these bombs exploded all round about us. Goodness gracious me. I run to the gangway that took us down to the second deck. I wasn't the only one, incidentally. There were an awful lot more running for safety. The second deck had above it 12 inches of armoured steel. A deck 12 inches thick, made of armoured steel. Now this inspired a wee bit confidence in us, having this above our head. However, when things quietened, we come up onto the decks again. The aircraft had all gone. Everything seemed peaceful and quiet, as though nothing had ever happened. And there we were, sailing into the grand harbour of Malta. And incidentally, before I go on to talk about Malta, in case you think our sail from Britain to Malta had been uneventful, other than going through the Straits of Pantelleria, let me hasten to assure you we had some incidents. At least 2, I think 3 submarines were sunk by the destroyers. They search for and detect submarines, and then they throw out depth charges. These are like big oil drums which are ejected from the destroyers and way out into the water. And these things sink to, I presume, a predetermined depth, and then they go off. Goodness, the noise, it's like the water seems to boil at that point. And then some seconds later, the bottom of the boat, the Valiant in which we were travelling, it was like somebody with a huge hammer hitting the bottom of the boat. It was a metallic clang as this depth charge went off. And as I say, on 2, I think 3 occasions, we saw part of the submarine come up out of the water and then straight down again. And a couple of destroyers circled the area for some minutes afterwards, but no, nothing happened, so I presume they had gone straight to the bottom. There was another funny little incident. We had an old aircraft, an old Walrus aboard the Valiant, which was used for spotting. See, we had spotting planes too. Now, the mechanics used to work on this all day almost. With the result, this thing used to be revving up. It was a noisy thing. And it used to rev up and rev up. And the sailors who were off duty didn't like this noise, obviously. Their off-duty time was being disturbed by this noisy thing. Now, we sent this aircraft off 3 or 4 times to do a bit of spotting. It was catapulted from the side of the boat. And it used to be funny. When this aircraft was being catapulted, all the sailors used to stand round in a circle and chant, "Sink, ya noisy thing, sink, ya noisy thing." I don't know what the poor pilot thought, with all these people chanting that for his plane to sink. It never did. It always came back, and it used to land alongside the boat. See, it had floats on it, and then this crane used to pick it up and bring it back on again for it to start its noisy drill the next day again. But it used to be funny to watch all these sailors stand. This was a ritual. Every time we went out, they stood and chanted, "Sink, ya noisy thing." So we had some funny incidents on our journey too. As the captain of the boat had promised, we were dropped off in Malta. A couple of big heavy trucks were waiting and took us to the headquarters of the regiment to which we were attached, the 7th Heavy Ackite Regiment. We went to a place called Manoel Island. There they took their particulars, as they do in the army, number, rank, name. We had our medical examination, etc. And were given 3 days to settle down and absolutely free to do as we wanted, have a walk out to see the place. Well, after 3 days, we were split up and sent to our various units. I, along with 3 other boys, was sent to the 13th Battery of the 7th Heavy Ackite Regiment. Well, we arrived in a small place by the name of Zurico, overlooking an aerodrome, Hal Far aerodrome, a military aerodrome, of course. It was away in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there were no buses or anything. If everybody went out and leave, you had, a good mile to walk to just a tiny little village, and a bus used to run from there twice, 3 times a day to the main town of Malta, which of course is Valletta. Well, here in Zuricho, I started my life as a soldier on active service. Now, at this time, in June 1940, life in Malta was very pleasant. The lads took to us very, very quickly after they realised that we, conscripts, were really human beings. You know, they were all regular soldiers, and some of them hadn't been home in Great Britain for years, and they'd heard about conscription, and they'd heard about conscripts, but they'd never seen any. And I don't know what the dickens they expected, but I think they expected us to have horns on our head or something. But however, when they did find out that we were human beings and really decent lads like themselves, then we were accepted. The number of questions they used to ply us with. Are the people at home really hungry? Are they really starving? Are they really being bombed? What's the latest song out? You know, the questions that they asked were unbelievable. However, as I say, we soon just became one of the unit, no different to any of the other regular soldiers. As I said, life in Malta at that time, in June 1940, was very pleasant in a sense. We used to have the occasional raid by the Italians, or the ITAs as we called them. They would send over 2 or 3 planes flying at a terrific height, drop a couple of bombs each, some of which hit the island and some didn't. They didn't seem to be in the least fussy where the bombs landed, as long as they got rid of them, dropped their bombs, turned tail and off home. Something I realised very quickly was the guns we were using were in fact the 4 new mobile guns that came with us from England. And I only realised then how few guns were in Malta. And for that matter of fact, how few planes were in Malta. At night, we used to watch 2 or 3 old biplanes, swordfish, go out. We didn't know where they were going or anything. This seemed to be the Air Force, our mighty Air Force in Malta. 2 or 3 old swordfish, with no fighter planes. But somebody evidently remembered that 3 old Gloucester Gladiators were stashed away somewhere in packing cases. These were hastily pulled out and the planes assembled, and there and then were born the 3 planes which later were to become world famous: Faith, Hope and Charity. The names given to the 3 Gloucester Gladiators which made up our fighting force in Malta for a long, long time. These pilots were heroes. They went up every time a raid came in, against sometimes overwhelming odds. 5, maybe 10 to 1. And yet they used to go up and fire their guns and really put up a very good show, a very good fight. 3, that's all we had. 3 old Gloucester Gladiators, Faith, Hope and Charity. We knew that conditions in Malta would soon change. Our fate was to a great extent determined by events in North Africa, which wasn't so very, very far away from Malta. The Eighth Army were there, fighting the Germans and Italians. And slowly but surely the Eighth Army were being pushed further and further back, which meant, of course, the Germans were getting nearer and nearer to Malta. And it was only a matter of time before, instead of a few Italians coming over occasionally and dropping some bombs from a gate height, that we were going to be visited by the German Air Force, the might of the German Air Force. Well, near the end of the year, we saw our first German aircraft come over and drop bombs. By this time we had managed to sneak in, because I think this is what had happened. They sneaked in some hurricanes and some Fairy Fulmars. These were fighter aircraft. But I mean, we only had a handful. Not nearly enough to ward off the Germans. Now, at the end of the year, as I say, they became more numerous. And I remember in the beginning of January in 1941, my job at that time, or rather one of my jobs, was to go to our HQ to collect the rations for our unit. I had an old truck with a Maltese driver, and we used to go, as I said, and collect the rations. Now, round the perimeter, the edge of the aerodrome, by this time we had some Bofor guns, manned by Scotsmen. I don't know who they were, don't know what unit it was, but they were spaced round the edge of the aerodrome, Lucca aerodrome. And when I was coming back with the rations from our HQ, I used to drop off at each of these gun sites and give them their rations. Well, I was coming across the aerodrome in this old truck this one particular day when all hell broke loose. Bombs started to come down, planes started to stream down, dive, it was pandemonium. It was indescribable, the noise, the bombs. Now, there we were, more or less in the middle of it. So we left the truck and run as fast as our legs could carry us to one of these guns. And at least we felt a bit safe, because the gun was firing away there much better, and at least we were helping, because we helped them with their shells and with fired rifles. It was really an awful day. When I got back, when things quietened down and I went back to my unit, the officer said, "Bombardier, are you all right?" "Oh yes, I'm all right, sir." He said, "Are the rations all right?" "Yes, they're all right, sir. But more important, sir, the mail's all right." And he laughed, because this is the first time from I had arrived in Malta in June up until January, we'd never had any mail. And that's a long, long time to go without hearing from your people at home. But as long as the mail was safe, I was very, very pleased. This was the start of concentrated bombing, which Malta had to suffer for the next 2 to 3 years. Daily, sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day, the Germans were over dropping bombs in Malta. I understand that there were over 3,000 air raids in which bombs were dropped on the small island of Malta. Now, when you consider that Malta is only 13 miles long and 7 miles wide, it is 91 square miles. They had 3,000 air raids and bombs dropped. There must have been thousands and thousands of bombs dropped on Malta. Now, fortunately, and in this rock there are numerous caves built away back in the good old days by the Knights of St. John or somebody, and fortunately these caves were still in good condition, and the Maltese used to live. Many of them actually lived in these caves. Otherwise the death toll in Malta would have been unbelievable.